Oregon recruiting is going to heat up in a big way here in the month of June. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks, which is why if you have not already, please like, comment, subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to or watch this show, which today is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Brian Smith, our Locked On Recruiting Insider here at the network, is joining me today, brought to you as always by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. Brian, the month of June and July as well, I feel like is when kind of the bulk of a recruiting class gets made. Oregon's currently sitting at 7 verbal commitments in the class of 2025 right now. How many do you think that could be by the time the month of June comes to a close?
I think 10 is kind of the understatement, is an easy number, but if you extended that 5 more days, it could be upwards of 15. Most of the kids are going to decide between now and say the 10th of July. And how often that's the case, I don't know. But I think most schools are kind of in that boat. Most of these kids want to get this done before their high school senior season. So minimum 3, but upwards of 10 even by the end of July is probably the safest way to look at it.
Do you think that that's a number that, is kind of the baseline for this is going well, the 2025 recruiting efforts are succeeding? Like within the next 3 weeks or so, should Oregon have double-digit commitments, meaning they would add at least 3 between now and the end of the month?
That's conservatively. A lot of teams, like Florida State as an example, they got a ton of visits the last weekend. The NCAA dead period begins after the 21st weekend. I think that Oregon's got a little more balanced plan. For whatever reason, Florida State did it differently. So that'll help them a little bit. But at the same time, they've got their lists are so good. They've done such a good job with all the preliminary. I would be shocked if they didn't get at least 3. They've done all the legwork. So why wouldn't you gain some of the benefits?
Let's talk about names because we have a lot to get to on today's show because, everydayers are aware of a lot of the names, but still there are new guys popping up all the time. Let's talk about 5-star offensive tackle Michael Fasusi, who I think is a pretty desired commitment amongst Oregon fans that follow recruiting. I mean, everybody would want this sort of guy, but positionally for the Ducks, the offensive line class is empty at the moment. You talk about a place that has the most room for growth where you typically add several bodies in a class. Oregon's sitting at 0, and Alik Terry's not going to let that continue for a long time. So let's start with the recruitment landscape for Michael Fasusi. Where do things sit?
I think this is one of the wilder recruitments because he could go to a lot of schools, but like Missouri, Texas A&M, Oklahoma are mentioned with him, SEC schools. Oregon, when I met him a few weeks back, he had an Oregon toboggan on. He was at a tournament. So, I mean, it's kind of ironic now that I'm on an Oregon show, but he didn't know where he was going. He told me at that point, he was like, trying to figure out where I'm going to fit Oregon into the visit list, but I'm definitely going to visit. It's really hard right now. And I'm like, well, I get it. But he doesn't know where he's going. And he didn't even know his timeline. Like he was overwhelmed. So Oregon's just on his mind. And that was right after he had taken unofficial, if I remember correctly. So they're in a good spot, but I have no idea where that kid's going. And I don't think Michael does either.
Is that a guy that Oregon needs to get for an official visit on campus if you feel like they're going to really keep themselves in the running when you have all those big time schools? And remind everybody what part of the country he's from originally.
He's from the Dallas area, but like he's a kid that I don't think has played football his whole life. And like when you shake his hand, it's like shaking a bear. Like he is humongous, really nice guy, but he is just massive. So the Texas, the Oklahomas, those kind of schools have all offered. He hasn't offered pretty much every program in the country. That's hard to get players out of. But as you know, and we've talked about this on this show before, for whatever reason, Oregon does well in Texas. They get somebody and they've got connections to that state. It's an important one too. But this is a kid that can literally pick up the phone and pretty much call all but maybe like 1 or 2 schools in the country and commit right now. So getting him to commit first would be really unusual. I would be shocked if that happened.
One thing to watch for in the month of June is Jonah Williams, who I see he kind of goes back and forth being listed as a safety or a linebacker. I was under the impression he's a safety, 5-star guy in the class of 2025. He's got an official visit lined up for Oregon on June 21st. Do you know if he plans to commit shortly thereafter, and whether that official visit is, hey, I want to get Oregon, a real shot, get him back in the running maybe a little bit, or is it just, well, I'm going to take an official visit to Oregon because, well, that sounds like a fun time?
I don't know the kid at all. And to answer the first part about the linebacker's sake, that's just opinions of recruiting sites. I think he could play either. He's a good enough athlete. You watch his film, who cares? Just sign him and figure that out later. But as far as Oregon goes, I don't know what his timeline is. But Oregon, even at one point, was like one of the teams that was most often mentioned, along with Oklahoma. And his recruitment information just went silent. Like, he is not doing interviews and all that kind of stuff, which it is what it is. Oregon gets one of the last visits. That's how they should look at it. I think for a school like Oregon that's out of state, they need to get him to come back to campus in the fall, even if he committed this summer, because it's easier to go to LSU, Texas A&M, Oklahoma, than it is to Oregon. So that first time that he takes an OV is huge. You don't care what he says right now. Just get him on campus. He might change his mind. Oregon built their program on doing that. They flipped a lot of kids' opinions because that campus is neat, and obviously the facilities are tremendous.
Yeah, and it feels like you've said that about more, particularly 5-star kids in the last couple of years, that they're just not doing as many interviews. They're not giving as much. Do you think there's a reason for that?
100% I do. They want to control the narrative, and they want the information to go to their Twitter account, to their Instagram account. And believe me, guys like me in the industry hate it. Makes our job extremely difficult. I had somebody call me recently asking about a player from an area that he should not have to be asking me about. That's not a good sign. There's a lot of people also giving these young men very bad advice. I'll leave it at that. And part of it is how you deal with media. When you do not go to camps, when you go to camps and just stand there and don't compete, there's a lot of that stuff. It will hurt you long term. So part of it is the media stuff, though. Once they get to about the official visit schedule, now there are some that don't do this, but they just shut it off. And it makes it really hard. The only thing we can do is contact their trainers and or their high school coaches, and that's still secondhand. There's nothing like a quote directly from the player. I can't do anything about it, though. It's their life.
Yeah, Williams is a guy that I'd be really interested to get. There are other defensive backs that Oregon is after of the 5-star caliber that could be playing safety, but that safety position has been one of turnover for Oregon over the last couple of years. Lost a bunch of guys from last year's room, of course, supplemented with transfers, and that's always great. But the depth there is not as strong, I think, for this year or next year as it is at other positions. So Jonah Williams, definitely a name to watch right there. But speaking of 5-star defensive backs, a guy who you do know well is Na'eem Offord. And we'll ask Brian about the latest on the Ohio State commit and whether he is going to stick with the Buckeyes. That's coming up next. This episode is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Game Time makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off, which is a lot better than prices going up. They have killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time uses all that to take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. You can save up to 60% buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, whatever you're looking for. And they've got all-in pricing. Toggling this feature shows the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. That might be the best thing they do of all the great things that they do. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, all one word, for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, Brian, let's talk Na'eem Offord here. He is still 5-star defensive back committed to Ohio State. There have been rumblings for a while, and of course, verbal commitments, and this applies to the Oregon kids as well. It's more about an undisputed leader at this point in the cycle, because we're still in early June. These kids are going to keep getting texts. They're going to keep getting calls. They're going to take visits. They're going to talk to coaches. They're going to do all sorts of stuff as time goes on. So you can never truly rule anybody out when you're looking at a recruitment at this stage because no one signed their national letter of intent just yet. But Na'eem Offord verbally committed to Ohio State. That's now a Big Ten rival for Oregon because everything makes sense in today's world. But this is a kid that you're very familiar with. What is the latest on where he stands with the Buckeyes?
It's very odd. On Friday, I found out that he was taking an official visit to Auburn. It's kind of out of the blue. Auburn was one of the schools that many people thought had a shot at him before he committed to the Buckeyes in the first place. For reference, Auburn's about 2 hours and 10 minutes from the downtown area where he lives in Birmingham. So it's not exactly hard to get there, but he changed from making the decision to take an OV to Auburn in the season to doing it now. So whatever, but he had a great visit. Auburn folks think they got a legit shot now. I didn't think there was any chance he was going to flip from Ohio State at one point, but now he's at least he took the unofficial to Oregon. Then he took the official to Auburn. So I'm starting to think it's a little more open than I originally anticipated. Maybe I misguessed on this a little bit or whatever, but he just seems different now. I don't know if he just committed too early. That's a possibility. But Oregon is supposed to get an OV in the fall, and so are some other schools. Like Florida might get one. Bama might get one. This is an interesting race all of a sudden.
Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier in the show, the bulk of Oregon's 2025 class will be made up this summer. We'll be talking about it plenty here on the show, but there are still going to be those guys like Aiden Breland in last year's class, for instance, committed the day of the Washington game when Oregon was in Seattle. He committed just like a couple hours before the game. It sounds like Offord is going to be that sort of guy where you're following that timeline throughout the course of the season and into the season as games get played. Is that kind of your sense that there's not really an opportunity for him to shut it down before the season starts?
I mean, he could, but these schools are going to recruit him through. And he's mentioned that he had originally planned to take the OV to Auburn during the season. I assume he's going to take at least one during the season. His high school coach is a great guy. He'll find a way to make that work, and Offord is best player to state of Alabama. I don't think it's all that debatable. So they're going to let him take an OV and kind of like, miss film after a game or whatever. It's not going to matter much. I don't think he's going to shut it down in the summer. I'll be very surprised. I think it's going in the other direction. It's getting broader instead of less. So I could be wrong, but I mean, he's taken 2 trips that I didn't expect him to in the last few weeks.
Another name that Oregon fans should be aware of that I have not talked about before here on the show is linebacker Noah McHale from out in California. Max Torres over at Scoop Duck logged a prediction for Oregon to land him in the 2025 class. He's from Laverne, California, which is not the most well-known part of the state necessarily, but you don't get a blue chip rating being from that area by accident. I think of a guy like Keith Brown from a couple cycles ago that was from Lebanon, Oregon. And when other schools were recruiting Keith Brown, who's now up at Washington State, I bet you they look at Lebanon, Oregon and go, where on earth is... I don't even know if I could point out Lebanon on a map if you just gave me the state of Oregon. It's one of the more remote spots. But that's kind of the sense I get, is that he is the sort of player that is incredibly talented, to be sure, but feels a little bit like a big fish in a smaller pond.
Well, he lives east of LA, and I mean, it's just out in the burbs. He's one of those kids, though, when you watch him play, I've seen him at 7-on-7 tournaments multiple times. Even as a linebacker, most 7-on teams will use a safety at the linebacker spot because it's all passing. He's really good at it. There's a reason that Southern Cal, Oregon, and Texas A&M are after him. He's legit. He told me a while back those were probably going to be his final 3, and he just announced those were. I think he's a great football player, and I wouldn't care if he was from a 1A school, and he's not. But he's just a guy that understands the game, and he makes really, really good plays on the football in the passing game. And the high school film shows him as a thumper, too. So this is an impact guy. He's played against good comp in California. I don't think he's going to have a problem making the transition. So, yeah, if he ends up at Oregon, they're going to get a heck of a football player.
Did he announce a commitment date when he announced his final 3, or is that still to be decided?
I did not see that if he did.
Okay, gotcha. We'll keep rolling through the names because, as I said, we got a lot of names to get to here. And we're going back to the defensive backfield. This also a name that I've not discussed before here on the show. Kainoa Winston is someone that Oregon's after. The other finalists, according to 24/7, are Michigan, North Carolina, and Penn State. Don't see North Carolina in the mix for a lot of players that Oregon, Michigan, and Penn State would be after. Those tend to be more heavy hitters in recruiting. But what can you tell us about Oregon's pursuit of him?
They're going up against Penn State, in my opinion, more than anybody else, because his brother is the safety there. And his brother might be the best defensive player on what was the best defensive unit in the country last year. So that's hard to overcome. But for whatever reason, the kids in Maryland like Oregon. That is so random. But yeah, I don't know what that is either. They always have kids visiting from that area. Anyway, he plays at Gonzaga, really, really good program. And he's a kid that could play corner or safety, doesn't even matter. His film is really good. Instinctive, has great speed. I think this is a guy that can make an impact at a lot of schools in year one in some capacity, not just talking special teams either. So Michigan, Penn State are probably going to be the ones that talked about the most. The North Carolina thing is a bit odd, but North Carolina, for DC area people, that school has just always recruited that in every sport. So that's the connection. I'll be shocked if he signs there, though. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I think Mac Brown's on his last leg.
That's how I feel as well.
North Carolina has a lot of pull in Virginia and DC. So that's just what that is, but they're not very good. So whatever. Drake May is no longer there, folks. I think he'll end up at one of the other schools. Penn State's my pick. But as always, Oregon is the outlier because you never know what's going to happen when a kid takes an OV to Oregon. It's random. I hate picking on Oregon kids.
I have a thought. Just a thought.
Oh boy.
Perhaps the Maryland to Oregon connection is just the direct appeal of going all the way across the country. Like if you want to go to the other coast, like you grow up in Maryland, which is, I'm testing my geography knowledge here, borders the Atlantic Ocean. Yes.
Yes.
Maybe you want to go somewhere that borders the Pacific Ocean, in which case you would then look at Washington, Oregon, and California as states, and you'd say, well, who's the biggest recruiting power out there? And though USC is seemingly making an effort, as you and I are talking about in today's episode of Locked On College Football, which you guys should go check out if you're interested, USC is definitely trying to up the ante on their recruiting a little bit, but Oregon is the premier recruiting team out west, so maybe that's the draw. I don't know. That was just random thought that kind of popped in my head. Like maybe they just think, I want to try out the other coast, just like complete, not Utah, not Arizona. No, I want to get all the way to the coast, and Oregon is the team. Or alternatively, perhaps more plausibly, Oregon just has a very in-depth recruiting staff, and they do a good job of covering their bases.
Maybe it's both. Sometimes kids want to get away from home. There are kids like that. Especially some of the inner city kids, like sometimes they just want to go as far away as they can get from Miami or Detroit or New Orleans, whatever. You see that. So it's possible. DC's got a lot of kids that leave. So maybe that's what it is.
Maybe it is. You never know. Because there are just so many things that go into a recruitment, contrary to what angry YouTube commenters might think. Oregon does not just recruit well because they have NIL dollars, though certainly it doesn't hurt, but that's not the only thing that plays into it. We're going to talk defensive linemen. For those of you that are big on the trenches, a couple of names, including one of the more fascinating recruitment stories that is developing potentially in Oregon's 2025 class. That's coming up next. All right, Brian, let's get into the trenches here and start with Josiah Sharma, who is a guy from out west. A lot of heavy hitters after him at the defensive tackle position. The other schools reportedly involved Bama, Texas, and Washington. And by the way, props to Jedd Fisch. This is not the sort of player that typically would have Washington in the mix if Bama and Texas and Oregon are there. But I think Jedd Fisch is a pretty good coach and also a pretty good recruiter. I think Dan Lanning is a really good coach and a really good recruiter. So how good of a chance does he have with his defensive prowess to try and land a guy like this?
They've got the advantage of location. You know, he's a California kid. Oregon recruits California better than any out-of-state school. And I think he's pretty familiar. He's been to campus already. I mean, I don't think there's a coach other than maybe Kirby, ironically, because Dan coached under him, that covets defensive linemen more. So this is an interesting recruitment. And your point about Fisch is also very accurate because he's known as an offensive guy. I will be surprised if he goes to Washington. They don't have the same cachet as they did. Bama and Texas kind of speak for themselves. When you see Bama and Texas on a D lineman's list, that's a player. They kind of pick who they want to recruit, not the other way around. So I'd imagine Oregon's in pretty good shape here because he just took the unofficial, but Bama and Texas make me pause a little bit.
Yeah, interesting note. Jed Fish was at Arizona last year. He's now up at Washington. His defensive coordinator last year at Arizona was Johnny Nansen, who is now the co-DC and defensive line coach at Texas, and I imagine is a big part of this recruitment. So I wonder if those ties kind of go back to their time at Arizona. I don't know if there was ever an offer, but just something that kind of popped into my head there, because Washington is not typically a blue blood recruiting school, but they do have Steve Belichick as their defensive coordinator. So maybe that name is carrying a lot of cachet for them as they try to get a guy like this. But when you watch Sharma's film, he's a big guy. Like, this is not someone who's going to play defensive end. He is going to play on the interior. He reminds me a little bit of Jericho Johnson, who's an Oregon 2024 signee. Just a big, hulking nose guard sort of presence.
That's pretty much what it is. The question I have is, does he develop enough skill to bounce back and forth between nose and three tech? And I know everybody runs a variation of a 3-3-5 or a 4-2. I get it. But in a three-man front, he can play nose. Can he play both spots in a four-man front and do it consistently? That's something we would have to find out after he gets to college. But you look at his frame, and I agree with you. Like, this might be your 310-pound nose guard that's starting as a redshirt freshman at Oregon or Washington or Alabama or something. There just aren't enough of those players that have the natural girth to play at that size and still not just be statues in the middle kind of taking up blockers. He can move pretty good. So again, like, Alabama's not going to recruit California D linemen very often. You're good if you're getting recruited, because we got a gazillion of them down here. It's by far the highest rated area for D linemen, Georgia, Alabama area. So I think this is a kid that has his choice to go wherever he wants, and he'll get recruited hard through signing day.
Yeah, California tends to be I feel like quarterback, running back hub. Receivers can come from all over, but linemen tend to be, the big kids down south, and California tends to be, you think of like the Bryce Youngs or any modern day players. Certainly there are good players that come out of the trenches out west, but the volume tends to be further down south compared to out west. But speaking of the trenches, a fascinating recruitment here for Oregon. So Tony Cumberland is a class of 2026 borderline 5-star defensive lineman. I think he was at one point, and now he's got a composite rating of 97 or whatever. Like, really, really talented kid. I saw a rumor, and maybe that's all it was, that he could reclassify to 2025. But then I saw that he is transferring high schools to Willamette High School in the state of Oregon. Now, I've seen other kids do that in other states. Does that strike you as odd? Because it struck me as odd. Like, I've seen kids go transfer to IMG in Florida, or move schools over in Texas. Like, high school transfers are not a supremely common thing, and Cumberland is moving states to come up to Oregon. I think that solidifies that whether he's going to be a 2025 or 2026 recruit, he's going to be locked in with the Ducks, to be sure. He's now going to be attending high school in the greater Eugene area at Willamette. But what do you make of all of that, Brian? Because it struck me as peculiar.
I'm not going to say everything I think about it, because I'm not sure that's going to be real positive on your show, to be honest with you. But, I mean, if that's what he wants to do, that's what he wants to do. It is weird. I don't know the last time I saw something like this in football, where it was just I don't know. Is that program any good? I have no idea. I've never heard of it.
I can't say I know it as a perennial power in the Oregon high school landscape. Now, I haven't resided in the state of Oregon during football season for a very long time. We're going on 8 years now. But I mean, typically your heavy hitters for Oregon high school prospects, you can get maybe one out of Medford a year, but it's your Jesuits, like Oswego every now and then, but not super often. Like, it's kind of random, but I have not heard. I can't recall one coming out of Willamette High School. I cannot. Maybe there is one. YouTube comment detectives, let me know if I'm forgetting one there. But like, the big time recruit, like Cumberland is a big time recruit in the class of 2026, but he could reclassify. I don't know. I just haven't. That was just the strangest thing. I saw it, and I had to do like a triple take where I went, he's going where? Like, all right, great. But do you think that at all is an indication that he could reclassify to 2025? Because Oregon along the defensive line, they've got a couple of players in Nasir Wyatt and Matthew Johnson, but certainly that's not going to be all the defensive linemen they get in 2025.
I would imagine that there's the other thing is to make it happen, because he's a big kid. Not a lot of guys would I sponsor on for the idea to reclassify. I usually think it's a bad idea. But he's naturally big. He's naturally athletic. He might have been the best player in Arizona as an underclassman. Debatable, but he was certainly in the conversation. Maybe if he goes up to Eugene, they got a community college there or something, he can take extra credit. There's something else to get him through the process easier. That would not surprise me, because it's to Oregon's benefit if they get him there earlier. That's the only thing I can think about, because if I was going to transfer, IMG would be the first place I would think. But Oregon's concerned about signing him. They're trying to keep him there and not get him to visit anywhere else. Let's not kid ourselves. That's their number one objective, whether they're going to admit that to the kid or not, because that's what I would want to do if I was Dan Lanning too. But the other thing is you got to take those classes, and I've talked to kids about it. Graduating a year early is not fun. That is a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
So good luck to him. I would not want to do that.
Yeah, and leaving the Arizona high school football scene for the Oregon high school football scene, I think is a testament to the caliber of player that he is. That he's not worried about that. Let's call a spade. That's a step down in competition. Arizona is a much better high school football state than Oregon is. Not to say there aren't good players, but the number of blue chip or even Division I football players that come out of the state of Oregon every year, we talk about it all the time, is pretty low. It's why Oregon has to go and recruit Maryland all the time or have a connection to Texas and whatnot. So fascinating. We'll see if anything changes there. Brian Smith will keep us in the loop as always, our Locked On Recruiting Insider. Brian, appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.